In this video, we're going to look at terrible archaeological finds instead. That doesn't mean the finds are worthless or deserve to be thrown away though. Instead, we're looking at discoveries that came with dark secrets. It's the same incredible trip around the ancient world we always offer you, but it comes with a dose of death and despair. There's no way to dress up this first fact. So we're just going to come out and say, in the remote regency of Tonat Raja in South Sulawesi, Indonesia, the bodies of dead babies are buried in holes hollowed out in local trees. The local villagers believed that the trees absorbed the bodies and souls of the babies over the passing of many years. So they placed the bodies inside them wrapped in cloth, then seal them into the trunk. The many holes and patchy repair jobs in the trunk of the region's trees stand is evidence of how often this process has been performed. There are thought to be several dozen deceased babies interred within each tree. The unusual practice is reserved only for babies who pass away before teething. As odd as it sounds, this isn't the only unusual way of dealing with the remains of the dead that happens in Tonga, Russia. It's perfectly normal for these people to dig up their ancestors, change their burial clothes, and then take them out for a walk around the village. So-called bog bodies occasionally turn up all over Europe. The conditions inside peat bogs are perfectly geared towards preserving the human form, so they can help the body retain its hair and flesh for thousands of years after they've passed away. One of the best preserved bog bodies ever found on the continent is that of the Holder Most woman, who's named after the place she was discovered in Denmark in 1879. Analysis of her remains indicates that she died around 2,000 years ago. She was around 40 at the time of her death, quite an advanced age for that point in history, and didn't mean a natural land. There are signs that she might have been a victim of human sacrifice, which would explain why she was cast into the bog wearing special robes and jewelry. The ancient Danes believed that peat bogs were portals to the underworld and to the gods, and that the gods were responsible for the provision of iron ore. It made all the sense in the world to them to occasionally provide those gods with a human sacrifice to keep them happy and keep the iron ore coming. Researchers from St. John's College in Cambridge, England, got the shock of their lives in April 2015 when they dug into the ground beneath their own college at Cambridge University and came across the remains of more than 1,000 people. After performing tests and research, they now think that the people buried here had been treated in a hospital cemetery for poor academics. The burial started during the 13th century and ended during the 50s. There are approximately 1,300 skeletons at the site, just over 400 of which are complete. While historians at the college have known there was a burial ground at the site since records were discovered in the 1950s. It had never before been found. And nobody had any idea it was so big. The idea that these are the remains of impoverished academics comes from the fact that almost none of the burials involved the coffin, and some of the people buried here appear to have been dumped in the ground without even a burial shroud to protect their remains. Oddly, there's no evidence of disease or serious illness in any of the skeletons, begging the question of why these people ended up in a hospital cemetery. This next artifact needs no introduction, and you'll recognize it immediately. It's the golden death mask of Tutankhamun, the famous boy pharaoh of ancient Egypt. It's one of the most famous archaeological artifacts in the world. But forget what you think you know about it, because we're about to change your mind. The iconic mask was first found a century ago when Howard Carter broke open the young pharaoh's tomb. What's new about the mask is a theory that says it may not have been made for Tutankhamun at all. Instead, it might actually have been designed for his mother Nefertiti. The theory comes from British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves, who studied the 3,300-year-old object and the era that it came from for much of his professional career. He has substantial evidence to back up his claims. He's been able to demonstrate that an inscription on the mask which dedicates it to Tutankhamun has been carved over the top of an older set of hieroglyphs which translate as living manifestation of the sun god, beloved of Akhenaten's beauty of beauty's disk of the sun. The gushing description has been found on many other artifacts associated with Nefertiti, but never before on anything belonging to Tutankhamun. Sticking with the theme of Egypt, a discovery made in Avaris in 2012 seems to confirm the existence of a practice that was previously thought to be a rumor. We're men. Archaeologists excavating an ancient royal palace came across 16 human hands divided between 4 pits in front of what's thought to be an ancient throne room. There were no left hands found, only right hands. They were approximately 3,600 years old, and date back to a period when the Hyksos people ruled over a portion of Egypt close to Tel el-Daba. King Kai was the ruler of the palace, and it's almost certain that the hands were severed as a tribute to him. Some historical records of the time indicate that the king would accept severed hands as a form of payment for gold reserves. The hands probably didn't belong to the people claiming the gold. Instead, they were presented by soldiers who would have severed them from an enemy of the king. They might have come from Egyptian people or from other enemies of the Hyksos from the Levant. Be questionable. What happened to the ancient region of Herxheimer in Germany is one that's puzzled experts for a very long time. Based on archaeological evidence at the site, it was once the perfect Stone Age settlement with rudimentary farm plots, identical houses, and an idyllic setting devoid of predators or other dangers. Nevertheless, the entire region was suddenly abandoned by the linear pottery culture people who lived there somewhere close to the year 4950 BCE. To make things even stranger, the people who fled left behind broken pottery, massive piles of human bones, and butchered human bodies. In the minds of many historians, there are only 2 possible explanations of what happened here. One is mass ritual sacrifice. The other is mass cannibalism. After his study was performed in 2009, the latter explanation became more likely. Scientists discovered tool marks on the bone showing flesh had been scraped away and deliberate breaks and larger bones that have been construed as an attempt to reach the bone marrow. Gruesomely, even the skulls were broken, in what might have been a means of extracting the brains. The Skull Tower of Nice in Nice, Serbia is exactly what it sounds like. It's a whole tower made from the bones, mostly the skulls of the vanquished foes of the people who built it. You might imagine that this is the barbaric legacy of something that happened many centuries ago. But actually, the tower was built surprisingly recently. It was constructed by order of the Turkish general Hershey Pasha from the remains of the Serbian rebels he defeated in 1809. Building the tower was a provocative and vindictive act. But Pasha was enraged by the tactics of the Serbs as their last stand at Seger. Hill came to an end rather than surrendering or fleeing. Serbian rebel commander Divan Centerlink deliberately blew up his gunpowder room, killing himself and his entire army in the process, but also wiping out Pasha's soldiers who had started to breach the trenches before the explosion. The 952 skulls in the tower were supposed to put the Serbs off the idea of trying to rebel again, but the move backfired. The second rebellion occurred 6 years later, and the Turks were driven from the region. Today, only 58 of the original schools remain and are enclosed by a chapel. 1,000 years ago in Britain, being buried face down was considered a form of punishment for immoral behavior. In May 2015, archaeologists discovered many such burials at an excavation site close to Oxford. The most surprising discovery is that of a woman who's thought to have been a nun. Immoral behavior sounds like an unlikely thing for a nun to be engaging in. But according to historians, she may have been buried this way because her peers thought she was sexually active. We don't know her name, but we know she lived at the Littlemore Priory Nunnery, which was founded close to the burial site in the year 1110. Historical record suggests that the nunnery was closed down during the 16th century because of the perceived immoral behavior of many of the nuns who lived there. Burying a woman face down was a punishment usually reserved for those who were suspected of being witches. So this particular nun must have really upset somebody. She's one of about 100 face-down burials in the area, but she was buried away from the rest of the group and closer to the nunnery. Now we go to Israel, where a mysterious lead tablet was found there in the ruins of a theater in Caesarea and Maritima. During the 1950s, archaeologists of the time were able to say that the tablet was approximately 1,500 years old, but they couldn't decode the meaning of its inscription. The code might have been cracked by computer software in October 2019. According to a controversial translation, the text speaks of the curse of the dancer. It's specifically directed at a dancer called Mana to another person, possibly also a dancer, harbored a significant amount of ill will. For the specifics of the curse include requesting several demons to harm Mana, tied together his feet, blind him, bind his hands, and generally make it impossible for him to dance. Thoth, the ancient Egyptian god of magic and wisdom, is named as a potential source of assistance in this unpleasant matter. It seems likely that Mana was scheduled to perform in the theater and an MBS rival didn't want him to. Christianity had spread to the region by the time the tablet was written, but it's apparent that the people of the era retained an interest in the dark arts. There isn't much left of St. Mary's College in Ellicott City, Maryland, USA. The college was abandoned many years ago. And now all that remains of it is the so-called Hell House altar. The unusual nickname comes from the fact that the college was once known as St. Mary's Hellhounds. Local legends connect the altar to ghost stories and occult practices, including the worship of Satan. The college was built in 1868 and tasked with training young men who wanted to become priests. It lasted just over a century before closing its doors for the last time in 1972, by which time there weren't enough wannabe priests left to train. Urban explorers and bored teenagers started roaming the property soon afterwards, and one group or the other likely set the fire that burned it down in 1997. Amazingly, one of the few things that survived the fire is the large metal Christian cross that sits behind the crumbling ruins of the college's faux classical dome. Nobody's ever managed to capture a photo of a ghost on the premises. But we still think you'd have to be brave to come here alone at night. If you think you can correctly identify what's at the site of the mysterious Baltic Sea anomaly, please report it to the nearest scientist as soon as possible. They've been waiting for answers for a very long time. First noticed in mid-2011. The anomaly looks like the product of intelligent design. Some people even think it looks like the Millennium Falcon spaceship from Star Wars and speculate that it's a crashed UFO. Scientists prefer to point to the likelihood that it's a natural geological formation. Although looking at these pictures, it's easy to see why people would doubt that nature made the game without any assistance. The object, if it's an object, is around 75 feet long and 25 feet tall and showed up on a sonar scan of the area of 300 feet below the level of the Baltic Sea's waters. Europe plays host to a surprisingly high number of underground streets, tunnels and cities, but none of them are as likely to take your breath away as Çamaklı in Turkey. This secret world has existed below Turkey streets for far longer than most European nations have existed. It's thought that the first people to live here set up their homes about 4,000 years ago. At that time, living in the darkness between the stone and mud walls was preferable to living in the light and being stalked from location to location by the tribes of barbarians that roamed this part of the world. For such a prehistoric settlements, Çamaklı is surprisingly well organized. It's 8 stories deep, and we're only allowed to see 5 of those stories. For reasons unknown, archaeologists and the Turkish national government have never allowed civilians access to the bottom 3 levels. We wonder what they might have found down there that they don't want the rest of the world to know about. The few things we do know about what lurks in the depths or impressive or even winemaking rooms in the Stone Theater. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.